I'm so honored to be here, and I bring you greetings on behalf of Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, a school that could not do what it does if it weren't for what you do here at Shepherd of the Hills. And I'm so fond of so many people in this congregation and so honored and privileged to be here to preach today. I don't really need to, because you've heard this gospel text proclaimed so wonderfully in song, but I'm going to read it anyway. The Gospel according to John, the first chapter, beginning with the 6th verse. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah nor Elijah nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal." This took place in Bethany, across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. This is the word of the Lord. Well, I'm honored to be standing in this pulpit this morning, and I've been admiring this pulpit from my chair. I'm especially delighted to be here on the day that you celebrate with this magnificent bluegrass band. This is a nice pulpit. It's clean and honest. I have a thing about pulpits because preachers are kind of suckers for pulpits. Pulpits symbolize the importance of the word being preached, especially in a Presbyterian church where we care a lot about preaching. But pulpits are interesting just in general. It's often the case that from the insides of pulpits, or from this particular vantage point of where I'm standing with this pulpit, and by the way, I'm going to take a picture of you right now because it's just not very often you can get Presbyterians to pack a house at 9:30 in the morning. So, everybody smile. There you are. That's great. You know, that's what you can do from a pulpit, right? I can see some things in and from this pulpit that maybe you can't see from where you sit. I've preached several times in the pulpit at First Presbyterian Church in San Antonio, for example, and they have this little toggle switch inside the pulpit that makes the preacher go up and down. If he's short, just flip the switch and he can go up. I'm waiting for them to invite me to preach there on Ascension Sunday. I've got a sermon for you. In many churches, from the pulpit, the preacher sees things that nobody else sees. She sees, maybe on the opposite wall from the pulpit, a clock. Now, why would a congregation put a clock on the opposite wall of a pulpit? Some pulpits are carved with sayings. Some pulpits have various saints and figures from church history that are carved in there. Some pulpits have special words in them, kind of a pep talk for the preacher. My favorite piece of pulpit wisdom, though, comes from the pulpit that I used to preach from when I served this particular church in New York on the north shore of Long Island. That church is now over 350 years old. It's the 5th oldest Presbyterian church in America. I was the 17th pastor at that time in a church that was 330 years old. Beautiful federal-style meeting house that sits on a village green in the middle of this Revolutionary-era cemetery. Was built when that community was a fishing village on the north shore of Long Island, and now that community is kind of an upscale suburb of New York City. That old church has clear glass windows on 2 levels. It has a second floor that's kind of a gallery on three sides, and there's a steeple so tall over this church that it's a landmark on the nautical maps for sailors who sail along on Long Island Sound. The people who came to that church when I was there was a mixture of a large number of professors from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, scientists at a national laboratory, aerospace engineers who developed military aircraft, a collection of school teachers and doctors and lawyers and bank presidents, and a small number of business people who took the train into Manhattan every day. Quite a brain trust, I always thought. Sometimes they intimidated me. And from the great pulpit of that church, which occupied one whole side of the sanctuary, one whole back wall, it seemed to loom about 20 feet above the air, above criticism. There was this little brass plaque on the pulpit that had these words. Only the preacher could see them. This is why you enjoy the perspective you can get from a pulpit. That little brass plaque, Pep Talk for the Preacher, bore the words from our text for today. He himself was not the light. He came to bear witness to the light. He himself was not the light. He himself was John the Baptist, who, as everybody agreed, was a great and stirring preacher. Yes, he was strange. Yes, he had a bizarre wardrobe. No, you wouldn't want to go to his house for a meal. But none of that mattered when he opened his mouth and started to preach. He was a no-nonsense preacher, probably not a manuscript preacher, not a lot of poetry, mainly just a lot of meat and potatoes right between the eyes kind of stuff, things like this. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? I tell my students at Austin Seminary that you should never preach a sermon like that unless they've already collected the offering. But he would just open his mouth and let it rip. The New Testament attests to how extraordinary John the Baptist was. In Mark's gospel, Mark introduces John as the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. John, the gospel writer, begins this very chapter of this gospel from which this text is taken with a hymn to Christ, a hymn about light. If it went to a piece of music that we've lost, it would go something like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. In God was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And right there in the middle of singing the hymn, John, the gospel writer, pauses long enough to insert a footnote. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. Just a little clarification, little footnote, and then singing again. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him, and on and on. Why did he interrupt himself like that in the middle of that hymn? It was because folks might otherwise assume that the hymn was about John. People did assume that. Herod, for example, after John was dead, when he heard about Jesus coming, he said, that's John again. Luke writes in the book of Acts that when Paul was on one of his journeys, he stopped in Ephesus and he ran into a group of disciples and he visited with them and he talked with them and discovered that they were disciples not of Jesus, but of John. All through the Gospels, if you look for it, you find evidence of a deep relationship between these two visionary, charismatic men, John and Jesus, standing there together at the hinge of history. It started with their mothers. Remember the story about in Luke where the angel Gabriel goes to Mary and foretells that Mary will bear a son who will be great and she will name him Jesus. And the very next thing we read after that is that Mary goes to her first cousin Elizabeth, and when Elizabeth hears Mary's voice, the child that she is already bearing leaps for joy. That's John. If Luke is right, then John and Jesus were only about 6 months apart in age, and they were close in other ways too. John baptized Jesus, John taught Jesus how to preach, and as a matter of fact, the first sermon Jesus ever preached, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. was John's. And what's more, Matthew and Mark and Luke all agree that Jesus didn't even begin his preaching ministry until John was muzzled there in prison, awaiting his own beheading, as if to say, I'm done, it's your time now. Which is to suggest, I think, that in spite of John's stature and the profile that he cut across the landscape of salvation history, John knew his place. He knew his vocation, his sense of calling, the purpose for which he was intended, that he himself was not the light, but came instead to bear witness to the light. There's a wonderful painting by this guy named Matthias Grunewald that serves as a centerpiece for the altar in this old church in Eisenheim, Germany. It's called the Eisenheim altarpiece. It's famous. It was one of Karl Barth's famous paintings. We teach our students at the seminary a lot about Karl Barth, German theologian of the 20th century who kept a print of that painting above his desk. And I'd like to think that Barth spent a lot of his time meditating on that painting. Maybe when he was taking a break from reading or from writing, he would put his feet up on the desk and light one of his famous pipes and look up at that painting. It's not what you would call a pretty picture. Actually, it's a heart-rending crucifixion scene. In the center is Jesus, and he is painted in enormous, outsized proportions. He's almost dead, and Mary Magdalene is kneeling before him. And then off to the side, there is a much smaller man pointing a long, bony finger at him. It's John the Baptist. And that painting seems designed to emphasize that the act of pointing away from himself and toward Jesus is John's vocation in life, his most important moral task. In fact, right next to where John the Baptist stands in the picture pointing, there is a Latin inscription, Illum opetet crescere me autem minui, which means, he must increase and I must decrease. That's what John came to realize is his own job description. John apparently figured out as a disciple of Jesus Christ that the good news of the gospel was that if Jesus was the light, then he, John, didn't have to be the light. I wonder if at some point somebody in that old church up in Long Island decided that that was the message that one of the occupants of that pulpit needed desperately to hear. Church people are discerning in that way. A number of years ago, as the seminary was preparing to change its curriculum, we sent teams of faculty members all over the country, not just the Southwest, which is kind of our bread and butter, but also everywhere else, Seattle, Boston, the Southeast, the Midwest, mainline groups, racial ethnic minority groups, evangelical groups. And these faculty teams interviewed these groups of pastors and then these groups of lay people in every place they went, asking them a series of open-ended questions and just taking notes on what they said. One question was this: what personal virtue does a pastor in the 21st century most need to have in order to be effective? We're a seminary, we want to know that. What's that virtue that a pastor in this day and time most needs in order to be effective? And then when all the interviews were over, this faculty team began slicing and dicing all that information and discovered that an overwhelming number of lay people answered that particular question with the same word: humility. Humility. What personal virtue does a pastor most need to have in the 21st century in order to be effective? Humility. We often get a clearer picture of what humility might look like when we get one of those many close-ups of its opposite. Tony Campolo is a liberal, evangelical, Italian, Southern Baptist minister from Philadelphia. It's not very often I get to use all those adjectives in the same sentence. But Tony Campolo, you might know him, is one of a million. He's a great preacher, and he tells a story somewhere of driving on a certain expressway down the middle of Philadelphia. It's one of those early expressways built probably before World War II and now part of our interstate system, but certainly not the wide, expansive multi-lane expressways that we know about here in Austin, Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, expressways that have ample shoulders, and we expect all kinds of room on those expressways. Well, this expressway simply had 2 lanes going that way and 2 lanes going this way. If you had a breakdown on this expressway, you were simply out of luck. Well, Tony Campolo had a breakdown, flat tire. His only option was to stop in the lane he was in to fix the tire. No shoulder. Stop there in the lane you're in, turn on the flashers, open the trunk, get out the tire iron and the other tools. Try not to get hit while behind you there is this ever-growing line of stopped cars blowing their horns. Boiling hot day, the windows were down, his radio was going, and suddenly the radio program was interrupted with an emergency alert. A grim radio voice announced that rush hour all over Philadelphia was at a virtual standstill because of some as yet unidentified problem on this particular expressway. At about the same moment, Tony heard this noise above him and looked up to see a traffic helicopter hovering over him, a guy leaning out of the helicopter with his mobile cam recording the whole thing. Tony Campolo says that the very first thought to enter his mind was, "It's me. I, Tony Campolo, have tied up the whole city of Philadelphia. I, Tony Campolo, am a traffic congestion superstar." There's something about much of the contemporary church that seems to encourage ministers to be superstars, to cultivate egos that inflate their own importance. And in this self-assertive, me-first world in which we live, these egos get fed on an altogether too rich diet of deference and adoration until we strut into our pulpits or strut up to a microphone at a Presbyterian meeting or just strut in any old setting and all but proclaim, "It's me, a superstar, God's gift to the church and the world in our time, me, a colossal gift to humanity." But what personal virtue are we most missing here in this Advent season and maybe in every season? Say it with me. Humility. Now, humility is not all shucks, not being afraid of your own shadow, having no convictions, being endlessly pliable and spineless. No, humility is thicker than that. Gordon Lathrop, who is a wonderful Lutheran theologian, wrote somewhere about this native tribe in northern Canada who are commonly called the Yellowknife, but in their own native language they call themselves the Tetsa'ini, which means those who know something a little. Their name, writes Lathrop, reflects the careful common life of a people surrounded by a vast and mysterious land marked by powerful natural forces. No one knows everything about such a land. But their name also reflects a community that treasures the life-giving, survival-enabling skills of the things that they know together. Know here, of course, means something more profound than be able to think about. It reflects rather experienced hands and eyes and lives in concert with each other as they face the beautiful rhythms of this larger land. Their name, says Gordon Lathrop, might be used to invite Christians to enter into reflections on worship and Christian life and discipleship with both humility and truth, to know things we really know, especially those things without which we cannot survive as Christians, and to be silent before the vast mysteries that remain. To know together the things that truly unite us, and to listen respectfully to our genuine differences. I love that definition of humility, knowing something a little, knowing those things without which we can't survive as Christians, and being silent before the great mysteries that remain. It's a definition we would do well to remember in this era of so many premature certainties. We need to learn from this Native American tribe in Canada. What personal value do we most need for the 21st century? Humility. And so it was a good thing, Sunday after Sunday, for me to climb up into that ancient pulpit in that ancient church and to behold over and over again, right here in the corner, the message of that little plaque. He himself was not the light, but he came to bear witness to the light. What makes the Christian faith, in my judgment, so profoundly countercultural is this claim that we are in fact not the center of the universe, that it's certainly not about us. Instead, the scandalous truth of the gospel is that we are people created by God, and God is the center of the universe. And it is God's Son, Jesus Christ, the one who came to dwell in our midst and whose coming again we await in this Advent season, who indeed is the light. Which means, of course, for starters, that John is not the light, and I'm not the light. And I've got good news for you on this third Sunday in Advent. You aren't the light either. Good news. Not having to be the light is what sets you free. Good news. Everything doesn't depend on you. Good news. You don't have to carry the weight of the world as if you were Atlas. Good news. You don't have to sit on that lonely and precarious throne at the center of everything. Good news. You don't have to make everybody happy. Good news. You don't have to be a brilliant or perfect adolescent every waking moment of the day. Good news. You don't have to make straight A's in order to be a complete human being. Good news. You don't have to avoid messing up occasionally in order to be loved. Good news. You are not the light. You're simply called. And that's why you're here in church, by the way, to bear witness to the light. My dear friend Michael Linval, who is a Presbyterian pastor and writer in New York and one of our former trustees, has written somewhere of that New Yorker cartoon that perhaps you've seen that pictures these two wealthy-looking tycoon types in double-breasted blazers standing together with their martini glasses on the lawn of a magnificent estate, probably in Newport, Rhode Island, overlooking the sea. And one of them is gazing out over the water, and he says to the other, "Sometimes I wish somebody else were captain of my fate and master of my soul." Well, good news. Somebody else is. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.